Welcome back. Now that we know what the methods are that are involved in neuroeconomics, from behavioral economics, psychology, and neuroscience, we'll talk about what the goals are of neuroeconomics. And fundamentally, the goal of neuroeconomics is to understand the biological basis of decision making. And decisions are relatively broadly defined here. They include economic decisions, but they also include social decisions. So why is it even interesting to study our biology in relation to decision making? Well, on the one hand, our biology enables us, right? So we have these brains with many interacting neurons. Well, there are 86 billion interacting neurons, as you'll see in the next slide. And they allow us to make relatively complex decisions. They allow us to keep things in memory. They allow us to pay attention to specific aspects in the environment. And these neurons interacting with each other allow us to plan ahead into the future. And so all of this enables us to make specific decisions. At the same time, we have limits on this. Our memory capacity is limited. On average, they say to about 7 items, but that can be improved, obviously, with training. And this is also seen in our decisions. So we make decisions typically based on a relative decision space. We don't consider always all options that could be considered for each decision. But we compare a relatively smaller set and then see which one's best from this smaller set. This might lead us to not make optimal decisions in all cases. So we have a brain that enables us to make decisions that are very complex, but at the same time, it's constrained. It can't do everything. But despite this, we make decisions that are mostly good enough, but they're sometimes suboptimal. And one of the things that I'm illustrating here is that, well, the complexity of the brain has actually evolved quite significantly. So if we compare ourselves to our closest ancestors, the chimpanzees shown here, we have a much more complex brain. We have much larger prefrontal cortices that should allow us to make relatively more complex decisions and also to plan ahead into the future. And based on what we have developed as humans relative to what chimpanzee societies have developed, you can kind of see the differences here and what a little bit more computational power in this brain can do, and obviously joined with collaborative efforts across disciplines such as neuroeconomics. So fundamentally, we're interested in our brain because it is the seat of all behavior. This is where behaviors are produced, and that's why we want to understand how the brain functions, particularly in relationship to economic decisions in our case, because our economic decisions on the one hand are linked to the computations performed by each individual neuron and by the combined computations that these neurons produce. So the brain is the seat of our thoughts, it's the seat of our feelings and our desires, and eventually it's the seat of behavior. It's what produces behavior, and that's what we're interested in, namely the particular kind of complex behavior that are economic decisions, that are social decisions. So the brain is the organ that produces and constrains our actions. And it is fundamentally biological in the sense that one of the main tasks of the brain is to make sure that we survive, that our bodies are well, that we are well nourished, that we are kept warm, that we are able to reproduce. And all of those things go into the computations that eventually then lead to the economic decisions that we study in behavioral economics and in neuroeconomics. Just to give you some facts about how impressive the brain is, as I mentioned already, the brain has about 86 billion neurons, plus minus 8 billion. That's the error term here. And each of these neurons makes about 7,000 connections, let's say 10,000 for easier calculations, with every other neuron in the brain. Not every other neuron, but with other neurons in the brain. So this leads to 860 trillion connections, which neuroscientists call synapses, and that's what I'm showing here. This is basically a synapse. So we have a neuron here. The brain is made up of 86 billion of these types of neurons, and they communicate with other neurons via these synapses. That's what's shown here. And at this level of the synapse, we have this chemical communication, which occurs by release of neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, which then makes the following neurons, all the neurons that are connected to this neuron, more or less likely to fire and contribute their computations to higher order cognitive processes such as decision making. Now, next, I'd like to show you a video that shows the involvement of the brain in behavior. So let's have a look at this experiment here. What you can see here is a rat that has a sort of safe place on the left side and a predator, which is called the robogator, on the right side. And the rat is relatively hungry. It's been food deprived for some time, and it wants to get the food pellet in the center of this cage. So what this means is we have a very motivated rat, but it's also relatively scared, and it's generally failing to get the food pellet, which is the little dot in the center of the cage. So let's just have one more look of the rat attempting to get the food pellet. And it fails again. And here's the same rat again, 2 weeks after or 3 weeks after an operation. One region in the brain was removed, and we can see here that, well, one thing is quite absent, and that's the fear response. The rat just grabs the food pellet and doesn't really care about the presence of this robogator or predator here. So what I wanted to illustrate with this video is the importance of the brain and behavior. And obviously what you could see there, and I think you may have guessed this, is that in the first part of the video, the rat had a functioning amygdala, whereas in the second part of the video, this amygdala was specifically lesioned, leading to quite some drastic changes in behavior. In the first part, you could see that the rat was fearful and scared of this sort of unpredictable predator that made these aggressive movements, and you could see her running away and not actually getting to the food pellet in the middle. In the second part of the video, this response, which actually is quite adaptive and leads to or ensures that an organism can survive, was removed, and you could see that this fear response disappeared quite drastically. So what this means is actually this is related to economic decisions, and the amygdala in this case was giving or providing a risk estimate of obtaining the food item that was lying in the center of this cage. Well, having demonstrated now the role of the brain in producing behavior that's also relevant in an economic sense, let's move to the historical origins of neuroeconomics. And there are basically two routes through which neuroeconomics evolved. One route is behavioral economics. And here you have the introduction of principles from psychology. For instance, starting in 1976 with the paper by Kahneman and Tversky on prospect theory. And then followed by the systematic search for choice anomalies by Richard Thaler. And both of these efforts have led to Nobel Prizes to Kahneman and Thaler, most recently in 2017. What this has demonstrated, obviously, is that there are limits to the rational calculations, the type of assumptions that standard economic theories or models make. So there are limits on our rational calculations that are imposed by our brain. We can only consider so much at a given time. There are limits on our willpower. At some point, we just don't want to restrain ourselves anymore or wait for a reward that might occur sometime in the future. There are also limits on our self-interest because we actually do care about other people and how other people think about us. So we do perform actions that benefit other people. And all of this question the Homo economicus assumption of traditional economic theory. So this was the development in the field of behavioral economics. At the same time, cognitive and affective neuroscience have been developing. In the 1990s, functional magnetic resonance imaging was introduced, leading to a whole new range of research that was then made possible by correlating brain activity with behaviors that participants were performing inside the scanner. So you had cognitive neuroscience on the one hand that studies the basis or the neural basis of cognitions, which include attention, memory, perception, and executive function. And you had affective neuroscience on the other hand, which studied the neural basis of fear, happiness, disgust, anger, basically emotions in general. Now, the cognitive neuroscientists, they became interested in looking at higher order cognition. So these are relatively low level, not executive functions though, but when we think about perception, that's a relatively low level thing that our brain does. It's encoded mostly in the visual cortex shown back here. And as a side note, you can see that a big chunk of the brain in green here is dedicated mostly to producing incoming visual information and making this information or passing on the information that's encoded to higher order cognitive regions. Here's the prefrontal cortex again. So they were interested in looking at higher order cognitive processes, and actually the experiments that behavioral economists developed provided a wonderful tool to look into these higher order cognitive decision processes. So that's one way that neuroeconomics evolved. On the other hand, affective neuroscience also is important for neuroeconomics because all of these emotions basically give us a reason to put in effort into our actions, right? So the brain typically doesn't do anything without, especially when it's effortful, it's relatively lazy. And one of the main tasks is to reduce effort, to maintain and preserve energy. So what it does when it needs to perform an action that is effortful, it has to have a reason, and emotions do give us exactly this reason. And as I said earlier, one of the most commonly used method here is functional neuroimaging, which evolved in the 1990s and then made relatively cheap and non-intrusive experiments looking right at the brain possible. So let's have a look at some basic lessons from neuroscience. So one of the things that neuroscience wants to do is, well, it wants to go beyond just the geography of the brain, which is actually something that was done in the late 1800s, and that was called phrenology, where scientists looked at the extension of bumps on the brain to try to make inferences about someone's personality. Neuroscience is interested in developing principles of brain organization and functioning, and it's mostly interested in, well, how do we develop mechanistic explanations based on neural functioning, the neuronal properties, and how these relate to behavior. And one important analytical distinction in brain processes that has been made by an economist, Colin Camara, are controlled versus automatic processes and cognition versus affect. You could see that distinction earlier in cognitive neuroscience versus affective neuroscience. But let's have a look at this. So what Colin Camara have developed is this two-dimensional model of neural functioning. Actually, it's a 2x2, so it has 4 cells. So on the one hand, we have cognitive processes, and these can either be controlled. So we have effortful processes that are available to us consciously. So we understand that something that we're doing is actually effortful, and we can reflect on it. But we also have automatic processes. They are performed in parallel. We don't have to think about this. So let's have a think about these kinds of automatic processes for a second. They include things like visual perception, which require quite a high load of computational power. As I showed you earlier, a large part of the brain is involved in this. They are performed parallelly and effortlessly. You don't have to think about it. Your brain does this for you relatively for free, right? You don't have to exert effort. Whereas speaking can be effortful sometimes, reading can be effortful, understanding things or computing mathematical equations, those things are effortful. They require us to think about it and to continuously put effort into this until we have the solution. It turns out that actually most of what the brain does are these automatic processes. So a large chunk of the brain is dedicated to just running things smoothly that you don't even have to think about. So while I'm speaking, I am observing obviously visually what's on the slides here, what's showing. I'm also breathing. My heart rate is being controlled by my brain. My digestive system is being controlled by my brain. Or just think about when you're walking. You don't have to think about every single step that you're taking. This is taken care of by your brain relatively for free. Obviously, there's an energy demand on this, and you will have to consume calories at some point. My point is here that most of what the brain does is automatic. You don't have to think about it. And this may have been ignored in part by economists that are interested in how we make decisions. There are automatic processes that go into these kinds of decisions. On the other side, we have effective things, effective processes that are also occurring. We have some control processes. We can control our emotions by regulating them. We can upregulate them, to make us more angry when that suits us, or we can downregulate them, let's say, to make us less angry when anger is not a good emotion to display at this moment. And also we have automatic emotional processes that are constantly ongoing. So we have certain mood states that we are more or less aware of while we're performing certain actions. What economists have mostly been interested is just this one quadrant here, but there are quadrants 2, 3, and 4 also to be considered, and all of these will influence how we make decisions. So more recently, behavioral economists have become interested in what are the effective processes in decisions. What are the roles of incidental emotions that have nothing to do with the decision and might fall into this quadrant 4 here? Or what are the roles of automatic cognitive processes that we're not aware of that also might lead to, well, maybe impulsive decisions? So this is what we've learned from neuroscience and from this model by Colin Kammerer on controlled versus automatic versus and cognitive versus affective dimensions of neural processing. And one of the questions then is, how does this influence our decisions? And this is something that Daniel Kahneman has thought about in a recent book that he wrote, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he basically also divides systems or decision-making systems into system 1, which is this sort of uncontrolled subconscious system. It's fast, automatic, emotional, and unconscious. And then system 2, which is slow, effortful, and infrequent, basically mirroring what neuroscience has taught us and what the model of Colin Kammerer has taught us as well. So let's have a look at how this might play out in the brain. So here's an example where I'm considering having a piece of sushi, which is lying in front of me. It looks quite yummy. I like it, and I want to eat it. So then there are a couple of processes that are going on. The first one is an automatic process, which is visual perception, which takes place back here in the visual cortex of the brain. This is then forwarded to an evaluation aspect of the brain, which is also automatically done for us. So it's an automatic process that consistently evaluates, is something good for me, is something bad for me, which happens in ventromedial prefrontal cortex here, which is then fed forward to motor planning. So now I made a decision, I like it, I evaluate this as something highly that I should eat. So I have to get my chopstick motor neurons ready to pick up the food and eat it. But then there might be some controlled effective processes. So it turns out I'm in a sushi restaurant and I may be on a date with a pretty lady. And that leads to some more controlled effective processes back here, which is the temporoparietal junction, which allows me to have cognitive effective processes about other people. And then up here is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which allows me to inhibit certain things. So I might not eat as quickly as I would if I was alone, and I might have more controlled motor movements because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of the partner that I'm eating with here. So we have all of these different systems that are playing together in a sense while we're making simple decisions of whether to eat sushi or not. We have visual perception, we have evaluation, we have motor planning, and then we have sort of higher order cognitive processes that may inhibit certain aspects, and then influence how I plan and how I evaluate certain aspects. And even, and that's one of the questions that's still open, maybe via top-down influences also influencing how I perceive things. So if I evaluate something differently because of the social context that I'm in, then this might actually influence the evaluation aspect here, which then also might influence how I perceive it. So maybe I don't see the colors as brightly anymore. I don't evaluate it as so positive anymore. In fact, this is what's been demonstrated in earlier neuroimaging studies, the fact that there is a distinction between controlled and automatic processes that can also be found within the brain. And this is exactly what this slide here is showing, namely the results from a meta-analysis that proposes this sort of dual process model within the brain. And what we see here are controlled regions, or a controlled network and an automatic network. And we have in the controlled network that is responsible for effortful, step-by-step and deliberately evoked behaviors. We can see those in the C system here, shown in the dark regions, including the lateral prefrontal cortex, the posterior parietal cortex here. This is the posterior cingulate cortex. And these are regions that we know are involved in behavioral inhibition and behavioral control. On the other hand, we have the X system, that is the automatic network here. And Lieberman and Satpute here are arguing that this includes the orbitofrontal cortex, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the basal ganglia, which really is the ventral striatum or the striatum in our case, and the amygdala. So this makes a lot of sense. So at the level of the brain, we can see what both Kahneman and Kamra have proposed in a theoretical model to also play out in these types of meta-analyses. And in the next slide, we'll talk about the distinction between cognitive and affective neuroscience. So in the next video lecture, we'll talk about this in a little more detail. So I look forward to seeing you then.